From the beginning until now, God's desire has always been for His people to reflect His glorious character to a watching world. In the garden, God created Adam and Eve in His image, commanding them to subdue and have dominion over His creation. As His image bearers, God's people were to rule on His behalf and reflect His image to the rest of creation. When God narrows His focus and makes a covenant with the nation of Israel, part of His commission was for His people to be a kingdom of priests. The job of a priest was to mediate between the people and God, giving God's instruction to the people and offering to God atoning sacrifices on behalf of the people. As in the garden, God's people were to represent Him to the surrounding nations. For this reason, because His people were commissioned to reflect His glorious character to a watching world, God takes their purity very seriously. Malachi addresses Israel's need to cleanse their community. Adonai calls for Israel to return to covenant faithfulness, obeying Him and waiting for His coming. The date of Malachi is not certain, but the issues addressed, like intermarriage, social justice, and tithes, are very similar to the reforms addressed in Ezra and Nehemiah, reflecting the post-exile period. Also, the mention of a governor fits a time after the monarchy. Using a unique literary form called disputation, Malachi addresses 6 issues in the post-exile community: love, sacrifice, covenant, justice, tithes, and service. In this form, the prophet first gives an argument, the issue being addressed. Second, he anticipates the people's response. And finally, he affirms God's original accusation, offering additional explanation. First, Adonai declares His love for the people. Yet in light of their past exile, their present oppression, and their pathetic future, in contrast to the prophet's grand picture of restoration, Israel questions God's love for them. Adonai contrasts Israel's past and present with the country of Edom. Israel's election and restoration is a mark of God's love. Though Edom is an object of God's care, in contrast to Israel, they were destroyed for their role in Zion's fall, and they will never be rebuilt. Second, Adonai accuses Israel's priests of defamation. When the priests question how they have dishonored God, Adonai mocks their folly in seeking His favor with blemished sacrifices. Would they really bring such worthless goods to seek favor from their governor? How much more so with God? It would be better to close the temple. Jealous for His name, Adonai will judge those profaning it. Unlike their forefather Levi, the priests were not instructing the people, but indeed were leading them astray. Though Malachi's message is addressed to Israel's priest, a very similar message is evident in the teachings of Jesus and His disciples. Just as priests, those teaching the law, and prophets, those speaking on behalf of God, received a very strong rebuke here, so we also are judged more strictly as spiritual leaders. Jesus said, "To whom much is given, much is required." And James cautioned that not many should aspire to be teachers, as they will be held in stricter judgment. So we must be careful to accurately portray God to the people in both our word and deed. Third, Adonai accuses the people of covenant unfaithfulness. The priests question why God does not accept their offerings. Adonai says He has rejected their worship because the people were divorcing their wives, dividing what God had joined together. He twice warns them to guard themselves and not be faithless. But why does God speak so strongly against divorce? God takes marriage so seriously because this human relationship most closely reflects His love for His people. But I want to issue a caution. We must emphasize God's ideal in marriage, striving diligently to avoid divorce, as He teaches throughout Scripture. As Jesus says, "What God has joined together, let no man separate." However, we must also guard against treating divorced persons as second-class citizens, as if God cannot redeem and use them for His work. We are all broken people, called by God to accomplish His purposes for His glory. Fourth, Malachi accuses Israel of wearying Adonai. When the people question how they have wearied Adonai, Malachi points to their questions about God's justice. They claim that God approves of the wicked and is disinterested in their affairs. In response, he promises to intervene, purifying the priesthood and destroying the unjust. Fifth, Adonai accuses Israel of robbing God. When the people question how they have robbed God, Adonai calls the people to again bring their tithes and offerings in obedience to his covenant. He promises to bless their faithful giving with abundant agricultural provision, which would be a witness to their neighboring nations. Now, there can be a tendency among students and ministry workers to assume that my calling is my offering. You might think, God doesn't need my money. And that's true. But in giving, you're showing your dependence on and thankfulness to God. If the people of Israel under the Mosaic Law gave a tenth, not including their sacrifices and offerings, then should we, as recipients of the new covenant in God's grace, lower the bar? I think not. Finally, Adonai accuses his people of speaking against him. When the people question how they have spoken against God, Malachi points to their questions regarding the benefits of serving him. Seeing evildoers prosper, God's people doubt whether he is interested in human affairs or even unjust. But God promises to separate the evil from the righteous, bringing fiery judgment for the former and healing and victory for the latter. In the same way, especially in times of suffering, have you ever wondered whether serving God is worth the cost? Take comfort in God's words here that one day he will bring justice, defeating evil and rewarding the righteous. The prophet concludes with two exhortations, obey and wait. Having addressed their legal violations, they're violating God's law in issues of sacrifice, tithes, and marriage. Adonai first commands his people to remember the law of Moses. Second, he concludes by calling the people to wait for Adonai. Before the coming judgment, God promises to send his messenger to turn the people back to God, a figure that Jesus later identifies as John the Baptist. In sum, with 6 disputations, Malachi confronts the post-exilic community with thinking and behavior that's in need of change. God's covenant confirms his special love for Israel. Thus he calls his people to be faithful to him and each other, offering only their best offerings. His justice will be vindicated in his return to judge the wicked and reward the righteous. Malachi closes with expectation of this glorious return. Obey his commands and wait for his coming.